My name is Claire Ashworth. I'm 29, and I found out what my engagement was actually funding from a storage unit invoice I never should have seen. 6 days before my wedding, I drove to a self-storage facility off Route 9 to drop off centerpiece boxes, and the gate code Marcus had given me for our unit didn't work. It worked on a different unit, his, Unit 214. Inside, under a drop cloth, was a crib, not ours. A woman's name was on the delivery slip taped to the box, Danielle Voss. That name is the reason you're here. What I did with my laptop over the next 11 days cost my fiancé $58,000 and something he valued even more than money. And that isn't even the part that ended him. The part that ended him walked into our rehearsal dinner in a green dress he wasn't invited to wear, and she wasn't the one I was worried about. Welcome back to Revenge Love Story, where quiet people finally close the account. If someone you loved ever treated your trust like a blank check, this story is for you. Drop a comment and tell me the moment you knew the truth wasn't going to be soft, and be sure to subscribe. I want to tell you about the crib first, because that's where the story cracks open. But you need the 2 years before it to understand why I didn't scream in that storage unit. I just took a photo. I met Marcus Bellwether at a client's open house 18 months into running my own event planning company, Ashworth & Co. He was the developer behind the property, tall, easy with a room, the kind of man who remembers a stranger's coffee order. I plan other people's weddings for a living. I know exactly how much a beautiful day costs and exactly how much of it is performance. Marcus felt like the real thing underneath the performance. That was the part I got wrong. He told me early on that he'd had a rough few years. A restaurant venture with an old college friend, Trent, had collapsed during a lease dispute, and Marcus was still bleeding from it. A personal guarantee on the build-out, a supplier lawsuit, a credit score in ruins. He showed me the demand letters. He cried once at my kitchen table, saying, "You're my rock, Claire. I'd never make you carry something you didn't need to know about." I believed him completely. And I want you to notice that sentence because he's going to say it to me one more time months from now in a room full of people, and it's going to mean something entirely different by then. I paid off $58,000 of Marcus's debt over 2 years, not in one check. I'm not reckless, I'm precise, but in 11 wire transfers, each one logged, each one tied to a specific demand letter he showed me first. $14,000 to the supplier lawsuit, $9,500 to a personal loan he'd taken to cover payroll during the restaurant's last month, $6,200 here, $3,800 there, always with paperwork, because paperwork was how I loved people. I told myself it was an investment in our life together. I told myself a man who showed me every bill was a man with nothing left to hide. I want you to sit with that. Because if you've ever confused someone's transparency about old debt with actual honesty about their present, you already know exactly where this is going. It wasn't only money, though the money is the part with numbers attached, and numbers are the part I can prove. I gave up the lead on a destination wedding in Charleston, 6 figures of billing, because Marcus needed me local during the worst of the lawsuit, sitting beside him at 2 mediation sessions where I said almost nothing and held his hand under the table. I co-signed an auto loan for him after the restaurant's collapse tanked his credit because he needed a reliable car for site visits, he said, and I remember thinking generously that a man rebuilding his life needed someone willing to put her own name on the line for him. I redesigned my entire business calendar around his court dates for 4 months. I told my own mother, when she asked why the wedding kept slipping later on the calendar, that Marcus just needed a little more time to get solid ground under him, and I believed that sentence completely while I was saying it. I want to be clear that none of this made me a fool. It made me exactly the kind of partner every relationship article tells you to be: patient, generous, unshaken by a hard season. What nobody tells you is that patience only protects you from someone who's actually having a hard season, and not from someone who simply found a stable, well-organized woman to fund a second life while he tells the first one to be patient a little longer. We got engaged 14 months ago. I built our wedding the way I built every client's wedding. A shared planning account, a vendor spreadsheet, a joint calendar, because that's my trade, and I don't half do my trade, even for myself. Marcus had access to all of it. I thought that's what partnership looked like. I didn't know yet that a man can stand inside your calendar and still be somewhere else entirely. The first crack came 4 months ago, small enough that I almost missed it, which is exactly how cracks like that are built to be missed. Marcus's phone buzzed on the counter while he was in the shower, and the preview banner read, "Same place Thursday? I miss you." Signed with a single letter, D. I didn't open it. I told myself it was Dave from his office, his business partner on a new development deal. I want to be honest with you about that moment because the honest answer isn't flattering. I didn't investigate because investigating would have meant admitting the wedding might not happen, and I had already sent 31 vendor deposits. Some part of me had started protecting the wedding instead of protecting myself. That's the trade every steady person makes eventually, and nobody warns you it's a trade at all. Over the next 3 months, the small distancing started, the kind you only see clearly in hindsight, laid out end to end. He started taking site visits on Thursday evenings that never made it onto our shared calendar, even though every other meeting he had went on that calendar automatically, synced from his work email. He started keeping his phone face down, then password locked, then in his jacket pocket during dinner. He canceled our Sunday tasting appointment with the caterer twice, both times citing a permitting issue at a property I later learned had a closed escrow 8 weeks earlier, information he had and chose not to update me on. He started referring to a work trip to Sacramento that never appeared on his firm's shared travel calendar, the one I could see because I'd planned his business partner's rehearsal dinner the year before and still had view access. Each of these alone is a Tuesday, a rescheduled meeting, a loud garage. It's only when you lay 12 of them end to end, the way I eventually did with the spreadsheet instead of a feeling, that a Tuesday turns into a pattern, and a pattern turns into a woman named Danielle Voss with a crib in a storage unit 2 miles from his office. Then came the storage unit. I need you to understand why I was even there. 6 days before the wedding, I was moving the last of our reception decor, 200 votive candles, a box of hand-lettered place cards, the arch garlands I built myself over 4 exhausting weekends, into what Marcus had told me was our unit at a facility 10 minutes from his office. He'd given me the gate code weeks earlier. I punched it in. It worked, just not on the unit he'd described. The app defaulted to the nearest unit under his name, and it was unit 214, not 118. I stood there a second, thought it was a simple mix-up, and rolled up the door anyway because I had 200 candles in my arms and nowhere else to put them. It wasn't decor. It was a life. A crib still boxed, assembly instructions taped to the side. A rocking chair. 4 sealed bins labeled in a handwriting that wasn't his. Nursery, Danielle's books, Dee's winter clothes, wedding registry. That last label made my stomach drop before my brain even caught up to why. And taped to the crib box, a delivery slip. Danielle Voss, an address I didn't recognize, a date 3 weeks earlier. I didn't cry in that storage unit. I want you to understand that part, because everyone expects the woman standing in front of another woman's crib to fall apart, and I didn't. I took 11 photos with steady hands, rolled the door back down, and drove to drop off my own candles at Unit 118, which existed exactly where he'd said it would. Then I sat in my car in that gravel lot for 4 minutes and did the only thing I have ever been good at when the ground disappears. I opened my laptop. I am an event planner. My entire profession is logistics under pressure, timelines that cannot slip, budgets that must reconcile to the dollar the morning of. I did not confront Marcus that night. I did not text Danielle Voss. I opened our shared vendor spreadsheet, made a private copy under a different file name, and started a new tab labeled simply Facts. Here is what 4 days of quiet, methodical work handed me, because numbers, unlike Marcus, have never once lied to my face. The $58,000 I'd paid off wasn't the whole picture. It was the visible half. I pulled our joint planning account statements and cross-referenced them against the 11 debt transfers he'd shown me demand letters for. 2 of the payments matched real creditors exactly. The lawsuit settlement was real. The rest, $31,400 of it, had gone somewhere the demand letters never covered. I traced the account numbers on 3 of his personal loan payoffs and found they routed to an account under the name D. Voss, not a lender, a woman. The $9,500 payroll loan from his failed restaurant had been a security deposit and first-month rent of a 2-bedroom apartment 11 minutes from his office, leased the same month he told me he'd had a rough year at my kitchen table. He hadn't just survived a bad business deal on my money. He'd financed a second household on it and rebuilt the story of a struggling man to make sure I never asked why the numbers didn't add up. I want to give you the numbers exactly the way I found them, because everything after this turns on them. Out of $58,000, $19,300 matched genuine, verifiable debt from the restaurant collapse. That left $38,700 unaccounted for. Of that, $31,400 had gone directly or indirectly toward an apartment, its furnishings, and a woman named Danielle Voss, over a relationship that, once I pulled old location tags off photos he'd forgotten were backed up to our shared cloud album, had been running for 2 years and 4 months, longer than our engagement, longer than half our relationship. The remaining $7,300 had gone to a jeweler in the same shopping center as the storage facility in a transaction dated 5 weeks earlier. I didn't need to guess what that was for. The crib in Unit 214 wasn't a mistake he'd made. It was a life he'd built in parallel to mine, funded quietly by the woman he kept calling his rock. The cloud album was the part that undid me the most, more than the crib, more than the ledger, and I want to be honest about that because it surprised me too. It wasn't a stranger's life I was looking at. It was familiar rooms shot from unfamiliar angles, the same downtown skyline I could see from my own office window, a coffee shop I'd recommended to him once, a hiking trail we'd talked about doing together and never had because he'd told me he was always too busy. He hadn't been too busy. He'd been there with someone else on a Sunday I remembered clearly because I'd spent it alone finalizing seating charts for our wedding while he caught up on paperwork. I went back through 11 months of photo metadata with the same patience I used to reconcile a vendor invoice against a contract, cross-referencing dates against my own calendar, and by the 3rd hour, I had built something worse than suspicion. I had built a second calendar, running quietly underneath our real one, with its own rhythm, its own Thursdays, its own version of a life he'd been building the whole time he was asking me to trust him with mine. I didn't sleep much those 4 days. I want to say that plainly, because the version of this story where the wronged woman is calm and unbothered the entire time isn't quite true, and I don't want to sell you a version of steadiness that isn't real. I cried exactly once, alone in my car in a grocery store parking lot for about 6 minutes over a jar of the specific brand of peanut butter Marcus liked that I'd picked up out of habit before I remembered I wasn't buying groceries for 2 people living one life anymore. Then I wiped my face, put the jar back, and drove home to keep building the ledger, because grief and precision, it turns out, can occupy the same body at the same time. Nobody tells you that either. I printed the summary to a single page. 12 rows, 2 years, one relationship I thought was mine. If you've made it this far, you might be the person I'm about to describe. I spent 2 years believing I was helping a man rebuild his life, and I was actually rebuilding someone else's nursery. If this is hitting close to home, pull one bank statement tonight and read it like it isn't yours. And if you want to know what happened at that rehearsal dinner, stay with me, because the woman in the green dress wasn't even the person who broke first. I didn't confront Marcus the night I found the storage unit, or the night after. I want to explain why, because it isn't the answer people expect. I had watched enough brides in my career fall apart in a parking lot the moment they learned something ugly, hand the moment to the person who hurt them, let the confrontation happen on his terms, in his timing, with his excuses ready. I had planned 200 weddings. I know exactly how a room's energy gets controlled, and I decided this room was going to be controlled by me. So I called a family law attorney I'd worked with professionally, a woman named Priya Dial, who'd handled a nasty vendor dispute for one of my clients 2 years earlier. I told her everything in one sitting: the transfers, the storage unit, the apartment, the 2 years. She told me plainly that because we weren't married, the money wasn't community property to divide. It was simply money I had given him, some of it under a version of events that turned out to be false. If a gift was induced by a material lie, she said, you may have a fraud claim, not just a broken heart. We can pursue repayment through small claims or civil court for the amount that didn't go to real debt. It won't be fast, but it will be real. I asked her the only question that mattered to me. I don't want a scene. I want the truth on paper where nobody can talk over it. She smiled the way people do when they recognize a client who isn't going to need much handling. Then bring me every statement you have, she said. We'll build a ledger even a judge who's never met either of you would believe. I spent the next week doing 2 jobs at once, finishing the wedding logistics I was contractually obligated to deliver for the vendors, because I don't leave a job half-finished even when the job is my own life, and quietly documenting every dollar with Priya's paralegal. I revoked Marcus's access to the shared vendor account first, not with a text, just a permissions change he wouldn't notice until he tried to log in. I moved the deposits still owed back to us from 3 vendors into an account only I controlled. I did not cancel a single thing publicly. I let every appointment stand. I wanted him walking towards Saturday believing nothing had changed, because a man who thinks he's still safe talks. A man who thinks he's caught only performs. I want to walk you through the 4 days between revoking his account access and the rehearsal dinner, because that's where you can watch a confident man discover in real time that the ground under him has quietly become someone else's ground. On day 1, he tried to log into the vendor account to approve the final floral invoice, found his access denied, and texted me, "Weird, portal's glitching, can you check?" I answered, looking into it, and did nothing because it wasn't glitching. On day 2, the caterer called him directly to confirm a final head count he could no longer see, and he called me 4 times in 90 minutes, the calls climbing in tone from breezy to clipped. I answered the 4th one and told him I was swamped with a client and would call him back that night. I didn't. On day 3, he showed up at my office unannounced, something he had never once done in 2 years, and stood in my doorway asking if everything was okay between us, if I was stressed about the wedding, if there was something he should know. I told him I was fine, and I watched him search my face for a crack that wasn't there, because I spent 2 years learning to hold a room steady for other people's worst days, and I used every bit of that training on my own. On day 4, Whitney texted me out of nowhere for the first time in months, a string of overly warm messages about the seating chart and how excited she was for Saturday, and I remember thinking professionally that nobody oversells enthusiasm this hard unless they're bracing for something. I filed it away. I didn't ask her what she was bracing for. I already knew where I'd be asking that question instead. His mother called it a rehearsal dinner. I called it the last room he'd ever get to perform in for free. The rehearsal dinner was booked at a restaurant Marcus had chosen. 32 guests, his parents, his sister Whitney, my small circle. Priya's completed report folded into a manila envelope inside my clutch. Whitney had been unusually warm to me all week, complimenting my dress, asking about the honeymoon, and something about the warmth felt rehearsed in a way I recognized professionally, the way a nervous mother of the bride oversells enthusiasm right before she asks you to move the whole seating chart. I filed that away and didn't say anything. Not yet. Marcus stood to give his toast at 8:40, glass raised, and delivered the line he'd clearly practiced. "Claire is the most stable person I have ever met," he said, looking right at me, "and I will spend my whole life making sure she never has to carry more than her share." The room laughed warmly. I smiled because I had learned by then how to hold a face steady while doing arithmetic underneath it. And I thought, not yet. Let him finish. That's when the restaurant's front door opened, and a woman in a green dress walked in without a reservation, scanning the private room until she found Marcus's face, and then, a half-second later, found mine. Danielle Voss, 26 weeks pregnant, unmistakably so, and holding a printed hospital appointment confirmation like she'd rehearsed carrying exactly that piece of paper into exactly this room. "I need to talk to you," she said to Marcus, voice shaking. "You said you'd told her. You said this week you'd finally told her." The room went silent the way a restaurant goes silent when something real walks into a space built for a performance. Marcus's mother's hand flew to her mouth. His father set down his fork. And Whitney didn't gasp. Whitney looked at the floor. And in that half second of not being surprised, she told me everything I needed to know about who had known and said nothing. Marcus stood there, his toast glass still half raised, and said the only true sentence he managed all night. "Claire, I can explain." I didn't raise my voice. I want you to understand that because everyone in that room was braced for me to. I set down my water glass, reached into my clutch, and took out the folded page Priya and I had built together. Not the whole file, just the summary. 12 rows, 2 years, 1 truth. I stood because the room deserved to see the whole page and not just hear about it. And I said in the same even voice I used to walk a bride through a run of sheets, not for drama, just for clarity. "This is every dollar I gave this relationship over 2 years," I said. $58,000. I want everyone at this table to see where it actually went, because I was told for 2 years it went to fixing his life. I touched the top rows lightly, guiding their eyes the way I'd guide a room through a run of sheet, not for drama, just for clarity. $19,300 was real. A real lawsuit, a real settlement, the thing he told me about first. I let that sit one beat. The other $38,700 is the part he never mentioned. $31,400 of it built an apartment and a nursery for Danielle. $7,300 went to a jeweler 5 weeks ago. I looked at Danielle, whose hand had gone instinctively to her own left hand, bare of any ring I could see, and I understood in that instant that whatever piece of jewelry Marcus had bought, it hadn't been for the woman standing in front of 32 witnesses either. "I don't think that ring was for either of us," I said quietly, and Danielle's face confirmed it before she said a single word. Marcus's mother found her voice first, the way mothers in these rooms always do, reaching for the only tool available to her, which was to manage the feelings in the room instead of the facts on the table. "Claire, honey, surely this can be discussed privately. There's no need to—" And I said, gently, because I had promised myself I would not perform anger even now, "There was a need for privacy for 2 years, and it was never mine that got protected." She stopped. "Marcus tried the version of himself that had worked on me at my kitchen table 2 years earlier. Claire, please, you're my rock. I never wanted you to carry—" And there it was, the exact sentence thrown back at me in front of the room he'd set it to build. I let it hang in the air a full 3 seconds before I answered, because some sentences only need silence to finish revealing themselves. "You're right," I said. "I never should have had to carry your rent, your furniture, and a ring for someone whose name I only learned 6 days ago. I'm not carrying it anymore. Any of it." That's when Whitney finally spoke. And I want you to notice she didn't address Marcus. She addressed me. "I told him in March you needed to know," she said quietly, not looking up. "I'm sorry, Claire. I should have called you myself." It wasn't nothing, but it wasn't enough, and both of us knew it. Somewhere down the table, one of my own bridesmaids had gone very still with her phone in her lap, and I understood without needing to check that by morning, some version of that room was going to exist for people who hadn't been in it. And I found, to my own surprise, that I didn't mind. I had nothing left in that room worth protecting quietly. Danielle hadn't sat down. She stood near the doorway the entire time, one hand resting on the curve of her stomach, watching the room absorb what she'd walked in carrying. And when I looked at her directly for the first time since she'd arrived, I said the only thing I had for her that wasn't about Marcus at all. "I hope your daughter has an easier 2 years than either of us just had." She nodded once, and I saw something in her face loosen that I recognized because I'd been wearing the same expression myself for 11 days. The specific relief of finally being believed by someone who has no reason to lie to you. I turned to Priya's envelope one more time, not to hand it to Marcus, but to his father, a retired contractor who'd always struck me as the only quiet, decent person in that family. "This is a copy for your records," I said, in case anyone tries to tell a different version of tonight later. Then I looked at Marcus and said the 2 words that had been building in me for 11 days. "It's handled." 3 days of quiet arithmetic and 2 years of silence compressed into 2 words, landing in that room like a verdict rather than a scene. I did not stay to watch what came after. I picked up my clutch, left the folded page exactly where the light had caught it, and walked out of a restaurant I had personally selected the lighting plan for, into an October evening that felt, for the first time in 2 years, entirely mine. Here's how it settled, because I know you want to know. The wedding, obviously, never happened. I called each vendor personally over the following week, not to explain, just to cancel, and every deposit I had already moved back under my own name stayed exactly where it needed to be. 3 vendors, hearing the short version of why, refunded portions I wasn't even contractually owed, which taught me something about the kind of people who build their living around other people's honesty. Priya filed a civil claim for the $38,700 that hadn't gone to genuine debt, built on 2 years of statements, delivery slips, and a location-tagged photo history Marcus had never thought to scrub. 6 weeks in, his attorney called mine with a settlement offer for the full amount, rather than risk a public trial with Danielle's testimony attached to it. Marcus paid every dollar back over 10 months, and payments I tracked in the same spreadsheet I'd once used for planning our wedding, which felt like the correct use for that particular document all along. I never once, across 10 months of payments, wrote a single line of apology to go with them. I stopped waiting for one around month 4. Danielle had her daughter that winter. I don't know her, and I never will, and I bear her no ill will. She was lied to in her own particular way, just with a different set of numbers and a different storage unit she probably never got shown. I heard, secondhand, through a mutual vendor who still does business with Marcus's firm, that he moved in with Danielle within 2 months of the rehearsal dinner, and that the arrangement lasted less than a year before it collapsed under what I can only assume was the same weather pattern that ended things with me. A man who is extraordinarily good at being someone's rock for exactly as long as nobody asks to see the foundation. He is, as far as I know, not especially present for either child he now has some claim on, which tells you most of what you need to know about a man who spends 2 years managing 2 women's belief that he's the responsible one in the room. His name still comes up occasionally in industry circles, always attached to a project that's slightly behind schedule and slightly over budget, which feels to me like a form of justice with very good bookkeeping. Whitney texted me once, months later, an apology that ran 4 paragraphs long, explaining that she'd found out about Danielle in March, that she'd told Marcus directly he needed to tell me, that she'd spent weeks agonizing over whether it was her place to say something herself. I read it twice. I believed most of it. I answered with one line, "I believe you're sorry. I still needed you to say something in March, not April." She didn't write back, and I don't think she expected me to answer any differently. We haven't spoken since, though I heard through the same mutual vendor that she left her brother's firm not long after everything came apart, which I choose to read as a small, private reckoning of her own. His parents sent a card, of all things, a month later, addressed only to me, no mention of Marcus at all. Inside, in his father's handwriting, was a single line. "You handled yourself with more grace than this family deserved. I'm sorry for our part in it." I keep that card in the same drawer where I used to keep vendor contracts I was proudest of. It felt like the only honest thing anyone in that family said to me the entire 2 years, and it came from the one person in the room that night who had never once made me carry anything. Ashworth & Co. is doing well. Better than well, actually. I picked up 2 referral clients directly from guests who'd been in that rehearsal dinner room. Women who told me, separately, that watching me hold a room steady while my own life came apart on a tablecloth was the reason they trusted me with their weddings. I still plan other people's weddings for a living, and I found I'm better at the job now, oddly, because I no longer mistake a beautiful shared calendar for an honest one. I check every vendor contract twice. I run a gate code myself before I ever hand one to somebody else. I've learned to check my own life the same way I check a run of show, line by line, out loud, before I ever trust it to hold. If there's one thing I learned from a rolled-up storage door, a delivery slip, and 12 rows on a single page, it's this. The people who call you their rock are often just naming the person they've decided will never ask to see what they're actually building somewhere else. And the day you stop being someone's foundation without also being their equal is the day you finally get to build something of your own, on paper you actually signed. That's my story. 2 years, 1 storage unit, and $58,000 that bought me the truth instead of the life I thought I was funding. If this reminded you to pull one statement tonight or to check a gate code that doesn't quite fit, take that as your sign and do it today. If you know someone always cast as the reasonable one, share this with them. Drop a comment, hit subscribe to Revenge Love Story, because next week, another quiet heart stops paying for someone else's lie.